AP Biology, Chapter 46, Animal Reproduction, Part 2. In the previous part, we learned about the male reproductive system and how we produce sperm. In Part 2, we're going to learn about the female reproductive system and how females make eggs. One of the things that you're going to have to review a couple times is the hormonal control of ovulation by females when we discuss it. So there's going to be some information that you're going to have to learn that's fairly complicated. All right, female reproductive system. Now the males have a two-hole system. They have the urethra opening as well as the rectum opening. Males and females both have a rectum located here, but females have a three-hole system. They have an opening for just reproduction and an opening just for excretion. Males have a kind of a double use for their urethra. They use it for both reproduction and excretion. So let's go through this step by step. We're going to start at the ovary. The ovary is the place where eggs are made, and remember that's done by meiosis too. However, when we're doing egg making, we only have one that becomes an egg. The other three become something called polar bodies that become reabsorbed by the female. The ovary releases an egg into the oviduct, also called the fallopian tubes, and females have two of those, just like males have two testes as well as vas deferens. The oviduct, as the name implies, it's a duct for eggs. Ova refers to eggs. The egg travels down the oviduct and eventually makes its way to the uterus. The uterus has a lot of blood vessels lining it, and that's going to be adaptive, as we're going to learn about later. The egg will lodge itself, if it becomes fertilized, inside the uterine wall and be provided nourishment from those blood vessels. This is the cervix. The cervix separates the uterus, where the baby would develop, from the vagina, which is just an area for the male reproductive parts. Also, as you can imagine, once the baby is fully formed, ready to come out, that kid is going to have to fit through that narrow opening as well. So we're going to have some stretching going on here as a process involved with childbirth. Here we have the bladder. As you notice, the bladder is separate from the reproductive parts on females. This is where urine is stored. Remember that we made that in the kidneys. Kidneys transferred the urine via the ureter to the bladder to be stored. And then the urethra throws the urine from the body. Now, one of the reasons why women tend to get more urinary tract infections than men is because they have a shorter urethra. And this is the shortness of the urethra, so bacteria don't have to go as far. And once they get in there, they can kind of colonize and cause some problems. Women that drink cranberry juice, the high acidity of the cranberry juice will kill some of that bacteria and kind of flush out any bacteria lining the urethra as well. So we have the front here where we have the urinary bladder as well as the urethra. We have the vaginal opening as well as the vagina itself for the male reproductive parts. Also, the kid's going to have to pass through that later. The cervix separates the vagina from the uterus. The uterus is where the fertilized egg lodges in and eventually develops to become a embryo, then eventually a fetus, and then eventually the baby. Here we have the oviduct. That's where the eggs travel down. This is also typically where the egg gets fertilized in a female. So if you can imagine, the male reproductive parts doesn't go past here. That's about as far as it goes. The egg is up here. So the sperm has to get from here to here. And as you can imagine, there's probably a fair amount of force pushing the sperm, and then the sperm have to swim the rest of the distance to get to the egg. The Bartholin's gland releases some fluid that's involved with sex that provides lubrication. Here we have the female reproductive system from a different view, front view. Here we have the ovary. We're going to talk more about this corpus luteum later. The egg is released into the oviduct. The oviduct carries the egg to the uterus. The egg embeds within the uterine wall. The rich supply of blood vessels provides nourishment for that developing zygote. Eventually it becomes a morula, then a blastula, and a few other stages that we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Also, you should know that inside the uterus wall is where we develop a placenta, and the placenta is going to be an area of an exchange between the mother's circulatory system and the child's circulatory system. And the placenta kind of leads to an umbilical cord that attaches to the child, and there's an artery and vein in there, and that artery and vein is going to be transferring glucose, oxygen, amino acids, other stuff from mom to the child, and waste products like carbon dioxide and urea from the child back to the mom. So mom's not going to be only eating for two, but she's also going to be peeing and providing oxygen for two as well. Here we have the cervix. You might have heard of something called HPV. HPV is human papillomavirus, and it's associated with cervical cancer. So if you get the HPV virus, they break the DNA codes. Viruses actually become part of your DNA, and the part of the DNA they break is involved with mitosis and cell division. So there is a greater chance that you're going to have cells that become cancerous if you have HPV, and that's involved with cervical cancer. So it's recommended that women get the HPV vaccine to avoid cervical cancer. Then the last part is the vagina, which is where the male reproductive stuff goes, as well as the exit opening for the child once it's ready to leave. All right, so let's go ahead and review some of the locations and functions of the following structures in females. The ovaries are where the eggs are produced. Oviduct, fallopian tubes mean the same thing. They're the connecting tube between the ovaries and uterus. Uterus is where the fetus develops. Cervix is the entranceway to the uterus. Vagina is the place where the male reproductive parts go. And the urethra is the tube that leads from the bladder to the external environment during excretion, which is not connected to the rest of this stuff. Now, this is fairly simple so far, but now we're going to start talking about hormones, and that gets a bit more complicated. All right, now there's two sex hormones that you need to know about that are involved with females. That's estrogen and progesterone. And they have some similar functions. However, they have different roles to play during the female cycle that we're going to talk about coming up. Both estrogen and progesterone, that you should know, are produced by the ovaries. And the estrogen stimulates the uterine lining growth. So the uterine wall gets thicker with blood vessels as a response to estrogen. And as you might have guessed, the extra blood vessels in that uterine wall are going to provide nourishment for any children developing there. This is also involved with the secondary female sex characteristics. Primary female sex characteristics are things like development of the ovaries within the female. The secondary sex characteristics of females are widening hips, and that's going to be triggered by estrogen. And from a survival advantage, wider hips give the child a bigger area to move out of the female's body with. Narrow hips have more problems with the head being able to pass and the shoulders being able to pass out of the female's hip area. Also, secondary female sex characteristics include breasts, which are the food source for the baby once it's born. The estrogen is going to be regulated by FSH and LH from the pituitary gland. If you remember, the anterior pituitary releases FSH and LH in males as well. In males, FSH stimulates the Sertoli cells to produce sperm in the seminiferous tubules. The LH, or luteinizing hormone, stimulates males to produce testosterone in the Leydig cells. In females, they stimulate estrogen as well as progesterone. Progesterone is also produced by the ovaries, and that's going to stimulate uterine lining growth as well, and it's also regulated by FSH and LH from the pituitary. Now, up until now, I think most of the structures and their functions were fairly easy to understand. However, the control of the female's menstrual cycle and ovarian cycle, basically releasing an egg, is fairly confusing, especially with all the hormones involved. So what I'd like you to do at this time is go ahead and write down these 6 steps involved with the female cycle, and then I'll go through it each in turn. Go ahead and pause at this time. Anything that's bold-faced is kind of used to kind of stand out a little bit as important parts of each step. I'll read this out loud so that you can understand what these words mean. FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, released by the anterior pituitary, stimulates the follicle growth, beginning of the cycle. Low levels of estrogen produced by the follicle suppresses FSH and LH. The follicle will grow, release more estrogen. which now at high levels triggers FSH and LH. So that's a little bit, it's like the opposite once you have a lot of estrogen versus a little bit of estrogen, which is kind of confusing. FSH and LH levels spike at day 14. Spiking LH levels triggers the egg, called the secondary oocyte, to be released from the follicle, rupturing it and turning it into something called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum releases two hormones now, progesterone and estrogen, which together suppress FSH and LH release and cause the uterine wall to thicken. If the egg is unfertilized, the corpus luteum disintegrates, dropping progesterone and estrogen levels. So I know that sounded fairly confusing, so we're going to talk about it in the next couple of slides. Go ahead and pause at this point, though, and make sure you get all this information down in your notes. All right, so let's go through this step by step. Step 1, this is the ovary, and we're going to be talking about the ovarian cycle, basically releasing an egg and what happens once the egg is released. Now, I'm going to start with going through the steps with this picture here and then take you through some of the graphs that are involved with the hormone levels as well. So we're going to do this a couple times. Also, one thing I want to point out with this picture, it looks like something's moving inside the ovary. This is moving here, all the way around in a big old clockwise circle. This is not the case. This is just how the diagram was drawn. This is all happening in the same place. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would all be happening in this one part of the ovary. We're just talking about different stages of the ovarian cycle of that one part. All right, so the first step, primary oocyte within the follicle. This little outside part is called a follicle, and inside we have an oocyte, or an egg. The prefix oo refers to egg, and cyte refers to cell. So when I say oocyte, just think of it as an egg. The second step is the follicles start growing. So here we see the growing follicle, and the egg is still inside. Now, primary oocyte refers to the egg that is arrested in meiosis 1, actually prophase 1 of meiosis 1. A secondary oocyte is in meiosis 2, but it only completes meiosis 2 if after it leaves the follicle, it becomes a fertilized egg. Once the follicle is mature, about halfway through the female cycle, the secondary oocyte is released and the follicle is ruptured. At this point, the ruptured follicle turns into something else, and it's going to produce two hormones at this point. Before the ruptured follicle releases the secondary oocyte or egg, it's only producing estrogen. And if you remember, if we look at our notes here, FSH released by the anterior pituitary stimulates the follicle growth. So the whole reason this follicle starts to grow to begin with is response to FSH, which appropriately named is called follicle stimulating hormone. So if you know what FSH stands for, follicle stimulating hormone, you also know what it does. It stimulates the follicle to develop with the egg inside. The second step is to produce low levels of estrogen by the follicle. Now, if you take a look here, here's our follicle. It's fairly small, and it's going to be releasing estrogen, and you should know that. The follicle releases estrogen. Now, at low levels of estrogen, when the follicle is still small, what ends up happening is the FSH and LH are suppressed. And as long as these FSH and LH hormones from the anterior pituitary are suppressed, you don't move on to the next step. However, the follicle continues to grow. And as the follicle grows, it's going to release more estrogen. Now, this is kind of the confusing part. When the follicle grows some more, it's going to release a lot more estrogen. And now the estrogen at high quantities triggers FSH and LH levels to be released in greater quantities. So at low levels of estrogen, you suppress FSH and LH. At high levels of estrogen produced by the follicle, you produce a lot of FSH and LH. And we're going to see these on a graph coming up. And this happens about day 14. Now, the LH will trigger the egg to be released from the follicle. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. So if you take a look here, we're going to have this follicle turn into something called the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone changes the follicle into something called corpus luteum. Corpus just means body, and the luteum refers to that structure. So we have the egg released from the ovaries now. We have a ruptured follicle that has turned into a corpus luteum. What's the next step? Well, if we look at our picture, here we have a corpus luteum, no egg inside, and this is going to start making some hormones, some additional hormones now. All right. So now the corpus luteum is going to release progesterone and estrogen. Remember, the follicle only released estrogen. With progesterone and estrogen together, that's going to suppress FSH and LH release and cause the uterine walls to thicken. If the egg is unfertilized, the corpus luteum disintegrates, dropping progesterone and estrogen levels, and the cycle repeats. If the egg does get fertilized, however, the corpus luteum stays intact, and progesterone and estrogen are produced the entire time during the woman's pregnancy, which will result in suppressing FSH and LH. So we never develop another follicle. We're going to have very low levels of follicle-stimulating hormone, and the two of these things together prevent any more eggs from being released. Now, that's kind of useful for people that are on birth control pills. Birth control pills are basically progesterone and estrogen together, and with the two of those together, they suppress FSH and LH and suppress any development of another egg being released from a follicle. And that's how you prevent from getting pregnant. You're basically tricking Mother Nature. All right, so here we have the corpus luteum that's going to be releasing progesterone and estrogen, and then if the egg doesn't get fertilized, the degenerating corpus luteum starts to shrivel up, and in response to lowering corpus luteum hormones, progesterone and estrogen, the uterine wall starts to slough away, and the cycle's over. After the end of the cycle, we have menstruation, which is basically refreshing that whole reproductive equipment downstairs for another round of egg fertilization and implantation. So you should be able to explain this step by step using this picture, but we're going to also go into the hormones now. Now, these hormones and their levels and what they trigger is fairly complicated, so you're probably going to have to review this a couple times, but you can understand it. Just make sure you go through it step by step. Remember, the first step is that we have the FSH released by the anterior pituitary stimulating follicle growth. So let's take a look at that. Here we have FSH right here, and that's going to trigger the follicle to develop. The follicle releases estrogen. Estrogen at low levels does nothing to spike FSH or LH levels. So now the follicle is going to grow and grow. As it grows bigger and bigger, more estrogen is released from the follicle. When enough estrogen is released, we end up having a spike in LH and FSH levels. So low levels of estrogen keep the other two brain hormones at low levels. However, when estrogen goes up in concentration in the blood, then that triggers LH and FSH to be released in greater quantities. In response to luteinizing hormone spiking at about day 14, the egg is released from the follicle, rupturing the follicle, and this process is called ovulation, or releasing the egg. And that happens at approximately day 14. Also, just as a side note, we still have high estrogen levels produced by the follicle. We also have a spike in libidos in women at about day 14, and that's interesting information. I guess if you really wanted to date someone, if you're a guy, maybe you would find out when the woman is not at work or has to miss a day because of her cycle, then backtrack it about, half a month. That's when she releases an egg. And that's when her libido is going to be higher, so that's the day you bring your biker jacket and motorcycle to work. All right, let's move on. So what happens after the luteinizing hormone is released? That's going to change the follicle into a corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum is going to release two things. It's going to release progesterone and it's going to release estrogen. And the two of these things together, progesterone and estrogen, keeps FSH levels and LH levels low. So as long as that corpus luteum is there, we're going to have fairly low FSH and LH levels, but we're going to have high levels of progesterone and estrogen. And that's what a birth control pill is basically these two hormones together. The corpus luteum producing these hormones are going to both together be involved with the thickening of the uterine wall. So when you have both estrogen and progesterone, the uterine wall thickens, we have more blood vessels there, and we're basically getting ready to be pregnant. Once that egg is released at any point, you can have a sperm fuse with it, and once that zygote forms, it's going to need food. nourishment, supply of oxygen, glucose, amino acids, all that good stuff. You're going to get that from the bloodstream. So a thicker uterine wall provides that kind of nourishment. However, if the egg does not get fertilized, we have a thickening of the wall, and the egg is still not fertilized, the corpus luteum starts to disintegrate. And once it disintegrates, it's going to release less progesterone and estrogen. As progesterone and estrogen levels start to decline, that's going to trigger the sloughing or breaking away of the uterine wall, the outer wall, and be released from the female's body. At the end of the female cycle, that uterine wall is sloughed off, the unfertilized egg comes out with it, and that's part of the menstrual cycle. And now we have a fresh start, and we're back at the beginning of the cycle again. So review. FSH, released from pituitary, stimulates follicle. 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 Follicle releases estrogen. Estrogen levels that are low suppress FSH and LH. See, LH and FSH still pretty low in response to estrogen at low levels. However, follicle develops, produces more estrogen. Once you produce a lot of estrogen, that's going to trigger the release of FSH and LH levels, and that's going to spike at about day 14. So lots of estrogen creates more FSH and LH. A little bit of estrogen by itself suppresses FSH and LH. All right, so once we have the luteinizing hormone spiking, that's going to cause the corpus luteum to form from the follicle, triggers ovulation, egg is released. Now the corpus luteum produces both progesterone and estrogen at fairly high levels that suppress FSH and LH, and are also going to be involved with the thickening of the uterine wall. If the egg doesn't get fertilized, then the corpus luteum disintegrates. The lowering estrogen and progesterone levels results in the end of the cycle. All right, this is probably the most complicated thing to learn about this chapter, so review it several times and make sure you ask any questions in class. Oogenesis, basically just making eggs. The O refers to eggs. Remember that we have 2 rounds of cell division. We have the first round of cell division called meiosis 1 that goes from diploid to haploid. We've got diploid to haploid, 2N to 1N, and we're going from 46 chromosomes to 23 chromosomes. Then at the meiosis 2 stage, we have another round of cell division. We are going from haploid to haploid, and now we have our egg. Now remember that in females, the rounds of cell division don't always result in an egg. In males, all 4 cells become sperm. In females, only 1 cell becomes an egg. The cells that are not becoming eggs become something called a polar body, and these polar bodies are just reabsorbed by the female. All right, fertilization. Fertilization happens within the fallopian tubes, also called the oviduct, and once that occurs, the egg will travel down and embed itself within the uterine wall. And as you can see here, it's starting to form some structures to kind of integrate itself with the uterine wall, and eventually we're going to be making a placenta as well as a umbilical cord to feed what this will become, which will be whatever animal this is. In our case, it'll be a human. So here's some pictures of early development. Remember the first round of cell division, mitosis. We're making 2 cells. If this was an identical twin, these 2 cells would separate, and each cell would become its own identical twin. That's not fraternal twins. Those are 2 separate eggs, but identical twins. Then we have a ball of cells, and eventually a larger ball of cells. And again, they're all produced by mitosis. Now the placenta is a exchange location across membranes. Basically, the placenta is located right here, and as you can see, we have the fetal arteries and veins and the maternal arteries and veins. And there is some separation between those two, but not much. And basically what we're doing is we're going to allow some things through, but not everything through. The things like glucose and oxygen amino acids, the smaller stuff, can go right into the arteries of the child, or the developing fetus in this case, and eventually make its way into the into the body of the developing person itself. All right, here we have an amniotic sac, something left over from a more primitive organism when our ancestors used to lay eggs, but no more eggs for us. We have a far superior system where we can keep on giving that developing fetus more and more materials and not have to worry about things like yolk. Also, consider this. If you lay an egg and you're a mother and you leave those eggs, well, any predator can come by and eat those eggs. However, if you develop internally and this little child is traveling around with you in a shock-absorbing amniotic sac full of fluid, well, if there's any predators around, you can take your child with you and avoid those predators. So there's some survival advantages there. So here's some early photos. At about 5 weeks in, we start detecting some brain activity inside the embryo. All right, so how is a child stimulated to be pushed out of the mom? Well, estrogen from the ovaries induces oxytocin receptors in uterus. So estrogen enables the glycoproteins in uterus to take up oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is released from the mom's posterior pituitary. Remember, that's also involved with secretion of milk from the breasts. The oxytocin stimulates the uterus muscles to contract. Remember, they're a type of smooth muscle, unbranched and unstriated. And also the oxytocin will stimulate the placenta and make something called prostaglandins, which stimulates more contractions of the uterus. As a result of some pushes from the uterus muscles to rhythmically push out the kid, just kind of like the digestive system has rhythmic, pulsing, smooth muscle contractions, we have kind of the same thing going on here. As a result of these pushes, we have positive feedback, which results in more oxytocin produced by the mom's brain, which results in more contraction, which results in more prostaglandins being produced, more contractions, positive feedback. So this is a good example of positive feedback in nature where the products of an action result in more products of an action. And that's why the doctor is like yelling at the mom to push, because the doctor knows that when the mom tries to push, that's going to stimulate more oxytocin to increase the pushes until that kid comes out. Now, typically the kid wants to come out head first. If the kid doesn't come out head first, there can be some problems with that. As you can see here, head first, the shoulders also can cause a problem. If the kid is turned around and the kid comes out feet first, sometimes the shoulders and head get caught on the vagina and cervix and can't make it out. So that could be a problem. And they might have to do a C-section where they actually cut through the abdominal wall and pull out the kid a different way. Here we see the kid coming out head first, and then eventually the umbilical cord comes out and the placenta comes out afterwards. In some prey animals like deer, they'll eat the placenta because after giving birth, all that blood, attracts predators, and as a behavioral adaptation, they reclaim some of the material from their body that is lost, as well as hide the scent by eating some of the things that would attract predators. I don't think any humans find that interesting. As far as another thing that happens sometimes, as the kid comes out, it pushes on the rectum. So sometimes they clean out the rectum of the mom first. Otherwise, the kid comes out with some other stuff from another area that is a little more messy. All right, talk about oxytocin and positive feedback. All right, the next couple of pictures you can pretty much ignore, but these are some of the stages of development. So if you're interested, just kind of watch the rest of this podcast. In day one, we have the first cleavage, basically the first cells becoming 2 cells. So that happens during day one. During day 2, we have a 4-cell stage. You don't have to know this for the test. Day 3, we have now 6 to 12 cell stage. Day 4, 16 to 32 cell stage. We are going to talk about this during development, so but you don't have to write this down now. But a solid ball of cells is called a morula. So there was a time in your life that you were a solid ball of cells, about 32 days old, and you were called a morula. You couldn't contemplate this because you didn't have a brain yet. Here we have some of the different places as well as the days and the stage of the development. Day 5, the solid morula develops a hollow fluid-filled blastula, which has basically the start of your coelom or body cavity. The embryo will develop from the inner cell mass or embryonic disc. There's going to be 3 distinct layers of cells to develop into different things that we'll talk about with chapter 47. At about day 6 or 7, that's when morning sickness kind of kicks in as a result of HCG. Day 10 to 14, pregnancy becomes established, fluid-filled amniotic cavity starts to form, yolk sac starts to form, and we have a placenta starting to form. At this stage, by day 14, the woman will have just missed her period. Remember, she will be releasing the egg at about the middle of her ovarian cycle. Days 15 through 21, we form some of these things here. Neural groove eventually forms the spinal cord and brain. It hasn't formed yet. That's where the brain comes from. Week 3, week 8, we have what's called an embryo now. So what was a ball of cells at different stages, morula, blastula, eventually gastrula, now is called an embryo. At day 22, the heart starts to beat. Now, some people say that when the heart starts to beat, that should be the start of life. But if you remember, the heart is just a pump. If I had to talk about what part of our body is distinctly human, I would have to say it's our brain. I can lose any other part of my body other than my brain and still be me. If my brain ever doesn't function anymore, I think whatever that was important about me ceases to be me. But that's different from other people. However, brain development seems to be more significant to the human experience in the heart. You can survive without your heart if you get a transplant, but you can't survive without your brain. Ooh, little souvenir from our ancestors' tail. Start to see the development of fingers. Still not much to look at. Starting to see the ear down here. So at about day 52, about 2 months in, a little less than 2 months in, we can start detecting brain waves. Teratogens are chemicals that have a detrimental effect on the embryo during development, especially when you have all these cells specializing, differentiating, and a lot of chemical signals that are only active at the very earliest development stages of our life. If we have chemicals that are interfering with how the organs are forming or how the brain's forming and other things, it can be pretty detrimental to the child once it's born. So that's one reason why we want to avoid things like smoking and drinking when you're pregnant. At about 15 weeks, it starts looking more like a real baby. Embryo is now called a fetus. A trimester refers to the period of pregnancy that the child is developing. So there's 3 trimesters. Remember, a female is pregnant for 9 months. So the first 3 months is the first trimester, second 3 months is the second trimester, and the third 3 months is the third trimester. Especially in the third trimester, the child is a lot more active. 6 months in. Lanugo is thought to be a vestigial structure resulting from the loss of hair from our ancestors, but we still carry the ability to make some of that hair in the baby. Some children are born with a larger lanugo or larger fur covering that we lost a long time ago when we split from the chimps. I must be a fetus. No. All right, and then finally the child's born. Give him a little smack to get those lungs breathing for the first time. Remember, up until this point, the kid was totally surrounded by liquid, and the child was eating and breathing and excreting all through the umbilical cord. Now that the child's left the body, everything has to be done by him or herself. Alrighty, so that ends our part 2 of chapter 46, the reproductive system.